I think we're going to start. Grab your coffee. And we're starting a little late, which means we'll go a little late, but the group is here, and we can start a terrific day of collective discussion. So welcome to the Spring Symposium of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. My name is Gary Wilder, the director, and it's called Practicing Translation, Translating Politics. So before we start, I want to thank Morgan Buck, who's not here, Zainab Oguz, who's not here, and above all, and above and beyond, Lindsay fucking Lee. Thank you, Lindsay. Really. Thank you so much. Working really hard all semester and bringing it together. So we had a wonderful start last night with R.A. Judy and Susan Buck-Moores in conversation with Suleiman Bashir Jan about his new book, Open to Reason. And we're going to continue today with an exciting schedule of papers from thinkers whom I admire a great deal. So this symposium, as many of you know, marks the end of a year of collective thinking about the politics and ethics and aesthetics of translation within the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. So I'd like to start the day by offering some introductory comments that in many ways issue from our faculty seminar, but which do not in any way purport to speak for the group, within which there are many lively disagreements, which is why it's beautiful. So our inquiry, at least from my perspective, took as given the important work done over the past generation on translation as an instrument of colonial domination and cultural hegemony, typically through explicit assimilation policies or implicit socioeconomic forces in the many confrontations between strong or majority and weak or minority languages under conditions of racial and colonial inequality. In many ways, we took that as given while taking it seriously. We also took as given the deeper epistemological critique of any notion of translation premised on seamless transparency and one-to-one equivalence, a critique developed with special force by post-colonial theorists who in so many useful ways warn against the danger and violence of presuming to translate across incommensurable languages and life worlds. When doing so, typically presumes the existence of a ghostly third term, a particular form or norm or framework or a concept that presents itself as an abstract universal metric. This critique, of course, is on point and invaluable. The question, however, is what we are to conclude from it. Do we reduce dense networks of translocal social relations to distinct Hegelian life worlds? Do we erect boundaries between an abstract universal history 1 and a concrete particular history 2? Do we undertake to delink and risk reifying the difference between Western and non-Western epistemologies? Conversely, if such conclusions are analytically dubious and politically limiting, as I think they are, how, nevertheless, can we both insist on entanglement and respect singularities? How to recognize incommensurable differences and refuse to posit false equivalences without drawing ontological conclusions about language, culture, life worlds, and history. That, in a sense, is the problem and the project. We might usefully route such questions, as we did in our faculty seminar, through Barbara Cassin's remarkable Dictionary of Untranslatables. Cassin and her collaborators also seek to provincialize supposed universals from the standpoint of untranslatability. Against analytic philosophy's assumption that there are universal concepts that transcend linguistic and historical specificity, Cassin insists that, quote, the universality of concepts is absorbed in the singularity of languages. She argues that concepts are always embedded and assume their particular meanings in specific languages and historical situations. Accordingly, she refigures the relationship between language and philosophy. Quote, we have tried to think of philosophy within languages. In order to find the meaning of a word in one language, this book explores the networks to which the word belongs and seeks to understand how a network functions in one language by relating it to the networks of other languages. From one language to another, neither the words nor the conceptual networks can simply be superimposed. Each entry thus starts from a nexus of untranslatability and proceeds to a comparison of terminological networks whose distortion creates the history and geography of languages and cultures. The method, she explains, entails tracing semantic crossings, transfers, and forks in the road, the turnings, fractures, and carriers that determine a period. It requires attention to the multiplicity among languages, in this case, primarily in Europe, and to multiplicities within any given language. Maybe this interest in process and multiplicity is what most distinguishes Cassin's untranslatable from Chakrabarty's incommensurable or Mignolo's decolonial delinking. She explains that the dictionary is opposed both to the logical universalism of the analytic philosophers, their indifference to language, and to the kind of ontological nationalism promoted by Herder and Heidegger that, quote, essentializes the spirit of language. She writes, "Our work is as far as could be from such a sacralization of the untranslatable, based on the idea of an absolute incommensurability of languages." She underscores that, quote, "To speak of untranslatables in no way implies that the terms in question or the expressions are not and cannot be translated. The untranslatable is rather what one keeps on not translating." What one keeps on not translating. It's a nice formulation. But once again, the question is what we do with Cassin's insights about networks and multiplicities and genealogies. At one point, she declares, Babel is an opportunity, but she does not adequately develop the idea. Indeed, most of the introduction is devoted to how the attempt to translate untranslatables across languages creates a problem. She seems interested above all in challenging erroneous assumptions about abstract concepts, neutral language, and transparent equivalence, and warning against mistaken impositions. The dictionary aims to create friction and to give pause to those who assume that translation is not a problem. It tends to treat translation as a necessary evil. I appreciate the importance of such an intervention, and I certainly embrace Cassin's understanding of the untranslatable as what one keeps on not translating. But I also propose that it may now be useful, as critical thinkers, to shift the center of gravity away from the danger of translation and toward this idea of Babel as an opportunity. For Derrida, the biblical Tower of Babel story figures translation as both necessary and impossible, something that God, through the imposition of linguistic plurality among humans, both demands and prohibits. On the one hand, Derrida rejects the dream of translation as seamless equivalence without remnants. On the other hand, his work demonstrates how every utterance must both cross and create the gaps that characterize translation. Thus, his famous provocation, "I have only one language and it is not mine," and his so-called law of translation. 1, we only ever speak one language. 2, we never speak only one language. Borrowing from Walter Benjamin, Derrida contends that, quote, "A text lives only if it lives on, and it lives on only if it is at once translatable and untranslatable." Benjamin insists that the most sophisticated texts, those which are singular and idiomatic, whose deepest meanings can never be simply transferred from one language to another, are the ones that are most translatable. This is because translation should never be a matter of communicating information or establishing likeness to the original, which he argues. For Benjamin, the task of the translator is to convey the mediated character of all communication in a human or fallen world, characterized by what he calls the foreignness of languages, or Babel. Shifting focus from dead texts and fixed meanings to living languages and the practice of translation, Benjamin calls on the translator to pay more attention to what he calls ways of meaning than to what is meant. Translation does not aim to recreate the perfect fit between language and content, or what he famously calls the skin and the fruit, but to index how that fit may be affected in any given language. Translation illuminates the very fact of linguistic mediation. In Benjamin's view, translation elevates and transforms the original text, the original language, and the translator's language. And it's that that constellation of transformations that I think are, and we were struck by in our group as very productive to think with. Recall the remarkable citation where he notes the mistaken premise of translators who, quote, want to turn Hindi, Greek, English into German instead of turning German into Hindi, Greek, English. The basic error of the translator is that he preserves the state in which his own language happens to be instead of allowing his language to be powerfully affected by the foreign tongue. This passage nicely conveys just the kind of strategy that I see so many 20th century Caribbean intellectuals with whom I am familiar pursuing. Think here of Aimé Césaire describing how he deliberately inflected, his term, inflected the French language as a way of both inhabiting it as his own proper language and rendering it subversively uncanny, thereby unsettling many of his metropolitan counterparts and Black Atlantic comrades. We might say that he introduces the problematic of translation or the opportunity of Babel into the very center of the French language, territory, and polity. These are the grounds on which he famously refused the false alternative between a narrow particularism that would lead to walled-in segregation and dilution and an emancipation in an emaciated, that's an interesting, emaciated, emancipated on the page, translation slips, and an emaciated universalism. I've repeated this line so much that it's like, where am I?
Emaciating you.
I know where I am in the words, but not on the page. Anyway, he envisioned as we know, famously, he envisioned a universal enriched and deepened by all particulars, by the coexistence of all particulars. And I invite us to think about those formulations in relation to this question of translation. Echoing Césaire, Edward Glissant challenges the modern imperial dictum that offers colonized peoples what he thinks is an unacceptable choice. Quote, either you speak a language that is universal and participate in the life of the world, or else you retreat into your own particular idiom, supposedly quite unfit for sharing, in which case you cut yourself off from the world and wallow alone and sterile in your so-called identity, end quote. This false binary disallows what Glissant calls, quote, relations of multiplicity or contagion when mixtures explode into momentary flashes of linguistic creation. He argues that when a specific people, quote, speaks its language, it makes its more general relationship to the world concrete and visible for itself and others. Glissant too invokes the Babel story to reject the opposition between a world organized around a united humanity with a universal language that elides differences, on the one hand, and a confusion of local languages that partitions peoples, obscures entanglements, and obstructs solidarities on the other. He writes, quote, I speak to you in your language voice, and it is in my language use that I understand you, end quote. Creating in any given, he declares, it is possible to build the tower in every language. So that's what he does with Babel, which we could talk more about. It is possible to build the tower in every language. We might understand Glissant's reflections on the poetics of relation, through which he elaborates a vision of transversal universality created through ramifying networks of opaque singularities as a meditation on the politics of translation. We could also usefully read Glissant in relation to Bashir Jan's double call that Africans should philosophize in African languages and that Africans should not hesitate to philosophize in non-African languages. John argues that philosophical insights are always bound up with historically specific languages, but he also insists that their significance may always transcend the linguistic and cultural contexts within which they were immediately produced. He argues that, quote, to philosophize in African languages is a means of thinking philosophically in translation and in crossing perspectives. This orientation frees him from a preoccupation with origins and authenticity. Whether writing about the worldwide circulation of Islam or of socialism, Bashir argues, quote, only translations exist without a text that could be claimed as the original one written in a sacred language. He beautifully crystallizes these insights when he writes, quote, translation is treason? Certainly, but this betrayal is the only fidelity. And that could be the kind of title or slogan of this whole symposium. Rather than debate whether a given philosophy can be adequately translated, Bashir develops a dynamic and reciprocal understanding of philosophy as translation and an ethical and dialogical understanding of translation as putting in touch. Césaire, Glissant, and Jahn are all fierce critics of Eurocentrism, monolingualism, and abstract universalism. Each is committed to grounding thought in specific historical situations, to exploring the specificity of African and Caribbean forms of knowledge. But each also offers something like an understanding of translational universalism that has epistemological, ethical, and political implications. We might then usefully put them in touch with Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the Portuguese social theorist who explicitly develops the link between translation and solidarity politics, or internationalism. Santos offers an understanding of intercultural translation, his term, as a living process that unfolds from what he calls the subaltern cosmopolitan contact zones. Those zones created by global capitalism and imperialism, which are characterized by diversity, inequality, and conflict, and which compel translation practices. In them, Santos contends, there is no general theory or meta-language to which these differences can be referred or disagreements adjudicated. He writes, quote, "The work of translation is basically an argumentative work, based on the cosmopolitan emotion of sharing the world with those who do not share our knowledge and experience. In these time spaces of mediation and negation," he says, "assumptions about cultural premises become arguments over premises that can never be definitively resolved." Santos underscores that intercultural translation is, quote, "not a gesture of intellectual curiosity or cultural dilettantism. It is rather an imperative dictated by the need to broaden political articulation beyond the confines of a given locale or culture." Accordingly, he links intercultural translation to what he calls the interpolitical translation that is at the heart of what he calls intermovement politics. He suggests that in the absence of a single universal social practice or collective subject to confer meaning and direction to history, translation becomes conjunctural, strategic, and experimental. It aims at reciprocity instead of worrying about source cultures and target cultures. It seeks to identify in each concrete historical moment or context which constellations of practices carry more counter-hegemonic potential. So that's his metric. The question is not, is it right or wrong, can we do it or not, but which translation practices carry the most counter-hegemonic potential. All of these thinkers help us to see that because there is no outside of translation, there can be no choosing for or against translation. Incommensuration and untranslatability, I would suggest, compose the very terrain of our thinking and acting. The question is not whether one supports or opposes translation, but whether this or that mode of translation affirms or disrupts existing assumptions and arrangements. Certainly, we need to challenge any facile positivist or imperialist understanding of translation as transparent equivalence, any will to find one-to-one correspondences as if concepts are not embedded in languages and cultures and situations. Such notions may still have currency among technocrats, scientists, analytic philosophers, the global business elite, New York publishing executives, or the monolingual US reading public. But it seems to me that no serious translator or activist would ever subscribe to such an understanding of transparent equivalence. We have a lot of translators, actual translators, here today, and maybe that's something we can talk about later. So this is the perspective from which I am interested in exploring the generative and subversive potential of translation practices. In reflecting on how translation might continually produce and protect singularities, not erase them. How translation may introduce, rather than seek to overcome, the kind of gaps that can displace conventional binaries or undermine reified boundaries. How, as a practice that confronts the perils and prospects of transformative connections across incommensurable domains, translation is intimately bound up with solidarity politics and would be crucial to any efforts to imagine a new left internationalism. Thus, our attention this year to translation as a dynamic and relational practice a practice of carrying across that may radically transform the source and target idioms and the translators themselves. I'd like to conclude with the image of Raya Dunayevskaya, Grace Lee Boggs, and C.L.R. James, friends, collaborators, and comrades in the New York section of the Socialist Workers' Party. Translation was at the very center of their friendship, their theorizing, and their politics. Boggs relates the productive, she writes about in her autobiography, the productive excitement and exploding insights for the group that emerged as she translated Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts from German, and Dunayevskaya translated Lenin's notebooks on Hegel from Russian, both of which enabled James to write notes on dialectics, and all of which allowed them, as the Johnson Forest tendency, to grasp the specificity of the American workers' movement in 1947. The point is not that the sacred Marxist text gave them the transhistorical truth, but that the practice of translation helped them to develop a conjunctural analysis of their specific political situation. Thinking across the semantic networks offered by German, Russian, and English, but also the historical experience of the industrial West, the rural East, and the colonized Caribbean helped them to grasp racial capitalism and the possibility of a revolutionary movement in the US that might be fueled by an autonomous party composed of the insurgent Black masses. This was the spirit that animated James' famous discussion with Trotsky in Mexico, where he advised the elder exiled revolutionary on how to translate Fourth International aims and strategies into a movement to organize African-American workers in ways that might also transform Marxism itself. This, according to James, was one of the lessons he learned from Lenin. He relates that Lenin's, quote, life's work was to translate Marxism into Russian terms for the Russian people. Likewise, James insisted that they could only build a mass party in the US by reconsidering Marxist theory in relation to American history and conditions and workers' consciousness and experience. So in his plenum address to the 1944 Workers' Party National Meeting, James declared, quote, to Bolshevize America, it is necessary to Americanize Bolshevism. Beautiful quote. Here we have a situated understanding of translation as a relational and dialogic practice that enables reciprocal transformations in political and ethical, and I would add social registers. So let me end here with a note on sociability, and again quote Grace Lee Boggs, who recalls, quote, CLR, Raya, and I were inseparable. Our energy was fantastic. We would spend a morning or afternoon writing, talking, and eating, and then go home and write voluminous letters to one another, extending or enlarging on what we had discussed, and then sending these around to other members of our tendency in barely legible carbon copies. Translation as sociability, Babel as opportunity. So I am thrilled to have this extraordinary group of scholars gathered here to share their work and think with us about these questions. You may disagree with every word I've said, but I have learned from all of you about Babel as an opportunity, about the untranslatable as the starting point rather than the final aim of analysis. So let's get started. Where are you going?
Oh, I need to sit down? Okay.
No, you don't need to sit down. I'm gonna chair this session.
Okay.
You can move up here.
I have no idea what you want me to do. I'm showing slides.
That's okay, go. I was just gonna say, and now we will move to the first session. That's all I'm saying.
All right. Okay. I'm moving, that's the point.
Okay, okay.
Sorry.
Let me introduce you guys.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, you can just start.
I'm sitting. No, go ahead. It's fine, I just want to know what to do.
So this is the problem with language.
But it's just a problem with disobedience. I just should obey Gary.
I'm sorry, Sadia, I'm not trying to, okay, I just wanted to start the first session. Okay, this first session, we have Sadia Abbas next to me. Her paper is entitled Form, Taxonomy, and Transcreation, and Ethan Kleinberg next to her. His paper is called Hebrew into Greek, Emmanuel Levinas's Talmudic Lectures as the Promise and Peril of Translation. So Sadia Abbas is Associate Professor of Postcolonial Studies at Rutgers Newark. She is the author of At Freedom's Limit, Islam and the Postcolonial Predicament, and The Empty Room, a novel, which you should all read. And your current book project is called?
Space in Another Time, an essay on ruins, monuments, and modern life.
Beautiful. And, sorry, Susan Buck-Moores was going to chair this session and got called away. So that's why this is all improvisational. And Ethan Kleinberg is a professor of history and letters at Wesleyan University and editor-in-chief of History and Theory. He's the author of Haunting History for a Deconstructive Approach to the Past, which you should also read, and Generation Existential, Martin Heidegger's Philosophy in France, 1927 to 61, and co-editor of the volume Presence, Philosophy, History, and Cultural Theory in the 21st Century. And he is, as a member of the Wild On Collective, he is also a co-author of the Theses on Theory and History. So, excuse the interruption, but we are going to start with Sadia, who's gonna present here, and you have slides.
Yes.
All right.
All right, if I can find them.
Perfect way to start things off. No worries.
I might need some help from, yeah, no, there we are. Okay. I'd like to thank Gary for the invitation, and contrary to what might have looked like a little spat there, we're actually profoundly dear, dear, dear friends. I count Gary as one of my favorite collaborators. Another one is sitting right there, Ginny Watson. I also feel at this point that if Space in Another Time gets written anytime soon, it will be because Gary and Ginny keep inviting me to contribute to things. So this is actually the second part. Might become the second part of a chapter, the first part of which was also presented here at the Political Concepts Conference. I've put up the names of the novels I'll be talking about today, just so that, because I'll be using short forms, but also because it's a little dizzying. I wanted to write them down in Urdu, but I haven't fully figured out how to do it with my computer at the moment, and because I have a new one, but also, and I wasn't going to inflict my own shoddy calligraphy on you, so apologies for not having the Urdu script. I really do believe it should be there. In any case, so my talk is called Formed Taxonomy Transcreation. In 1998, the Urdu novelist Qurratullain Haider, often called the greatest Urdu novelist of the 20th century, published an English version of her Urdu novel Aag Ka Darya, which had come out 40 years before in 1959, and it was completed, as the text at the bottom of the Urdu version tells you, in 1955. She called this English version a transcreation, a term she took from P. Lal, or Purushottama Lal, the writer and a translator of Mahabharata and Shakuntala, among other texts. Its title, River of Fire, that's of the English version of the transcreation, was a literal rendering into English of the Urdu title. Although she had not used the term transcreation to describe it, she had conducted a similar operation on her 1979 novel, Aakhir-e-Shab ke Humsafar, which she translated in 1994 as Fireflies in the Mist. And I'm going to from now on, refer to Aakhir-e-Shab ke Humsafar as Aakhir-e-Shab, just for purposes of not repeating it over and over again. The Urdu novel's title, literally Fellow Travelers of the End of the Night, was taken from the great communist poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz's poem, Sham-e-Firagh Apna Pooch, Don't Ask Now, of the Evening of Parting. With characteristic irony, Haider called the Urdu text, Aakhir-e-Shab, an abridged version when her English one was published. Now, and of course, just a quick note here, Faiz famously used the tropes of Urdu love poetry, and of the ghazal, to figure the devastations of partition and of parting in that sense, right? So, connecting stories through their location in spaces in Uttar Pradesh in northern India, old names, Shravasti, Ayodhya, Awadh, Lucknow, names changing with time, and indexing different empires, religions, and social assemblages, Aag Ka Darya / River of Fire span a couple of millennia, covering around 320 BCE, the time of the Mauryan Empire, the Lodi dynasty, around 15th century, 14th century, sorry if I'm getting this wrong, the British consolidation of the empire after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and the period of independence and partition. It's kind of an astonishing book. And she also repeats the names of certain characters throughout, so they the same names keep coming up over and over again in different social configurations. Akhir-e-Shab covers the period from about 1939 to a few years after 1971, the year of the war that led to the creation of Bangladesh, the civil war in Pakistan. Fireflies, and this is why I'm referring to each text by different names, Fireflies begins earlier in the British Raj and ends also a few years after 1971. At stake in Heather's use of transcreation to describe River of Fire were notions and deployments of ekphrasis, that is the verbal description of visual art, issues of novelistic, philosophical, and historical form, the competing and frequently intersecting metaphysics of Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism in India, and the political instantiations of colonial taxonomy and epistemology, the most tragic manifestations of which were the partition of 1947, a civil war woven into the very inception of independence, and the bloody and genocidal civil war of 1971 in Pakistan, which led to the creation of Bangladesh. I should say that I'm both from Pakistan and my family are immigrants from UP. And part of what's at stake in Heather's novel is the devastation of UP culture, which was a seat of Urdu literary, literary flourishing throughout the 19th century. So part of what is happening in the back and forth in the English and the Urdu is, in this 40 years, there's been an absolute evisceration of a certain kind of sociality and social assemblage predicated in Urdu, and it's now taken a kind of a host in Karachi, places like Karachi, which is also where I'm from, as a refugee immigrant, and still called Mahajir culture, Mahajir meaning immigrant. So in any case, so there's something kind of devastated about both books, both Aag Ka Darya and River of Fire, but then also later the other two. Her interest in art and architectural history and the career of archaeology in India were fundamental to her transcreations, which in turn revealed the imbrications of the Greek and Indian archaeological situation, the entwinement of Orientalism and Philhellenism, and the emergence of varieties of nationalism in South Asia, in Greece, and Asia Minor. Those connections, I should mention, are the subject of the book, from material from which this talk is taken. I will mention some of these briefly, but I can't go into them into detail for reasons of time. Some are discussed in Unmixing, which will be up, I'm told, and assured, and other things, on the Political Concepts website soon. And in Neither Greek Nor Indian, an essay in Gary's and Ginny Watson's wonderful volume, The Postcolonial Contemporary. So, for my first reading, I'd like to focus largely on Fireflies. In Akhir-e-Shab, the first chapter is called Chandargunj, and the opening paragraph presents a spare and austere description of a room in the eponymous house. In Fireflies, Heather added 2 chapters to the beginning, the first, Caledonia, and the second, The Golden Album. The opening paragraph is about the Ganges as it weaves its way through the Indian subcontinent and arrives near Dhaka in East Bengal, followed by a very short history of the city. The second is a meditation on Dhaka's architecture that connects India to the American colonies, a connection present at the end of the Urdu version when the female protagonist, Deepali Sarkar, migrates to Trinidad, but extended here into the beginning in a way that speaks to the global colonial situation. I can't go into these connections in any detail here, I will in the book, but do find myself thinking of Derek Walcott's Omeras and its description of plantation architecture, and also his wonderful segment on European sculpture and art. Heather writes, Muslims, quote, Muslims were in a majority in East Bengal, and this is from Fireflies, and some of the nobility and the titular Nawabs of Dhaka continued to live in this dreamy old town surrounded by broad rivers. The city had many splendid houses built during the days of the Dutch and English East India companies. Identical colonial mansions had come up around the same time in the southern plantations of faraway America. The Mississippi and its paddle boats and the rivers of Bengal and her gleaming steamers evoked a similar atmosphere of romance, of long song-filled voyages, high winds, and lonely sunsets. Caledonia was also a planter's house, built in Dhaka by a Scotsman called MacDonald Sahab. Georgian architecture had long been a part of Bengal's landscape, end of quote. The title Caledonia is quite exceptionally loaded in the context of Indian history, and to understand what's at stake, one might begin with the foundational roles played by James Ferguson, historian of architecture, and Alexander Cunningham, the archaeologist, both Scotsmen, in the classification of ruins and monuments across South Asia, a classificatory structure fundamentally linked to the taxonomy of religious grouping and religion in the Indian subcontinent. Thus, to quote Tapati Guha Thakurta, quote, Buddhist, an architectural denomination became synonymous with the racial purity of the Aryans. Northern Hindu, as a linked category in the chain, was placed on the same side as the Aryan/Dravidian divide, end of quote. She quotes Ferguson, quote, the traditions of the Tamil races at the southern extremity are infinitely more imperfect than their northern neighbors. And, you know, he has many other such assertions, end of quote. For Ferguson, these were bound with a, quote, larger vision of civilizational decay. And one might turn here to Ferguson's picturesque illustrations, and I'll show you some of them. So this is actually not from Picturesque Illustrations, it's the cover from his rock-cut temples of India. But then these are from Picturesque Illustrations. And to me, one of the interesting things about it is, in fact, if you compare this with paintings of Greece and of the Levant from the, I mean, they might as well be the, you know, it's the same melancholic, but kind of representation of ruins. And this one particularly, I think, with the broken columns at the bottom. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So these are some of them. So here's a quotation from Picturesque Illustrations. I know of no one characteristic that can be predicated with perfect certainty of all the styles of architecture in Hindustan, except the melancholy one that their history is written in decay. For whenever we meet with two specimens of any sort in the whole country, if one is more perfect than the other, we may at once feel certain that it is also the more ancient of the two. And it only requires sufficient familiarity with the rate of downward progress to be enabled to use it as a graduated scale by which to measure the time that must have elapsed before the more perfect could have sunk into the more debased specimen. And I fear the characteristic is not less applicable to all the institutions, both moral and political, of the people than to their arts, end of quote. In an address to the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1900, Curzon, the Viceroy of India, invoked the responsibility of the colonial state to the ruins, which were of course also monuments of India. His address is a fairly stark instantiation of the rhetoric of the white man's burden and of the responsibilities of imperial rescue, as it is the Christian government's duty to rescue the monuments from a, quote, local and ignorant population, end of quote, just as it is to rescue it from the occasional excess of militaristic English barbarism that has led to the building of barracks and messes and canteens in the fairy-like pavilions and courts and gardens of Shah Jahan. Of course, that was Curzon. It is also, he says, quote, equally our duty to dig and discover, to classify, reproduce, and describe, to copy and decipher, and to cherish and conserve, end of quote. However, the speech is perhaps most interesting in suggesting the explicit link between architectural and art history and archaeology on the one hand, and the Sanskrit studies of Orientalists like William Jones on the other. quote, then after the linguistic work of the Sanskritists like William Jones, and this is still from the same speech, a period of research on ruins and monuments. The pen was supplemented by the spade, and in succession, descriptions, drawings, paintings, engravings, and in later days, photographs and casts, gradually revealing to European eyes the unrifled quarries of Hindustan. Unrifled no more, I might add. In this generation of writers and scholars, special honor must be paid to two names, end of quote. He goes on to mention Ferguson and Cunningham. Citing the religious impartiality of the Christian British government, he says about the architecture associated with each religion, quote, each fills a chapter in Indian history, each is a part of the heritage which Providence has committed to the custody of the ruling power, end of quote. And when I expand this chapter, I want to have a section on custody battles and colonialism. Of course, as Viceroy of India, Curzon was also to oversee the soon revoked partition of Bengal, without which the later partitions of India and then of Pakistan would have been inconceivable. A lesser known division is relevant here as well. In the carving out of the Northwest Frontier Province, a division which is now in Pakistan, a division relevant to us also in the context of the war on terror that we keep talking about, that zone, and conceptions of the AFPAC border, Elphinstone had invoked the Scottish clans to describe the, quote, tribes of the area. In fact, I've argued elsewhere that the language of the kind of undefeatable tribe is very linked to the language of the Scottish Highlander and comes out of certain sort of discourses and anxieties of surrounding Scottish unification in Britain. Although the reasons given for the partition of Bengal under British rule were usually administrative, as Tamit Sarkar has shown, Curzon's reasons were political and came wrapped in a language of violence and dismemberment. Quote, the Bengalis who like to think themselves a nation and who dream of a future when the English will have been turned out and a Bengali Babu will be installed in Government House, Calcutta, of course, bitterly resent any disruption that will be likely to interfere with the realization of this dream. If we are weak enough to yield to their clamor now, we shall not be able to dismember reduce Bengal again. And you will be cementing and solidifying on the eastern flank of India a force already formidable and certain to be a source of increasing trouble in the future. End of quote. He did not forget, as Partha Chatterjee points out, the other parts of the colonial strategy, partition, which was meant in Curzon's words to, quote, invest the Mohammedans in eastern Bengal with a unity which they have not enjoyed since the days of the old Muslim viceroys and kings. End of quote. Discourses of primitivism, ruination, partition, and architectural history were entangled and proximate in colonial India, and Heather uses Caledonia, title and chapter, to invoke these at the beginning of her haunting novel about the two partitions of 1947 and 1971, and the two extraordinarily bloody partitions of the, I might add. The double sundering of peoples and territories central to colonialism and late imperial expansion was, of course, shaped profoundly by colonial epistemology and the classificatory and historicist impulses of discourses on antiquity. And such historicism was very much tied to the complex dance between the positing of origins and the erasure of origin in the service of claiming to be their telos. It's worth remembering that when Johann Wilkeman, the art historian of classical antiquity, who might be said to have laid the foundation for all of Greece, wrote about the perfection of the ancient Greeks, it was to offer Dresden as the new Athens. Heather recognized that the positing of origins was also a claiming of inheritance. And in the 19th century section of River of Fire, and I'm switching to the other novel for a minute, and she presented an anonymous, quote, conscientious Englishman's letter to the Calcutta Gazette, in which Salamis in 470 BC, Plassey 1757, the Reformation, Roman ruins and cathedrals that replaced Roman temples get pressed into an inexorable, if slightly comic teleology in the service of asserting the divine providence upholding English colonialism as destiny. Can we do anything about the heating? I think people are freezing, especially at the back. I don't know if anything can be done, but somebody came and went, okay, I just feel like guilty for holding you as you shiver. So here's the quotation. I do believe that the superiority of Europe over the Asiatics was decided for all time to come when Persia was defeated finally in the long drawn out war against the Greeks in 470 BC at Salamis. And remember, this is an Englishman in this novel, this Urdu novel, which the English version of the Urdu novel, writing a letter to the Calcutta Gazette. So 470 BC at Salamis, the victory of Plassey in 1757 is only a recent example. What India also needs is a reformation of the kind, and he's now sounding like Wolfowitz, we had in Europe in the 16th century. But given the complexities and very ancient roots of their superstitions, one cannot visualize it happening here. All of the Roman Empire became Christian. All over Europe, Roman temples were pulled down and cathedrals built over the ruins, end of quote. Moreover, into that novel, Heather would also weave a complex meditation on the antiquity of Greeks in India, as well as the case for the Greek fight for independence from the Ottomans, complexly mirroring the Muslim and Greek case, and you should read the essay in the Ginny and Gary's volume if you want to know more about that one. So complexly mirroring the Muslim and Greek cases and ironies of both Byron's identification with the Greeks against the Ottomans and the Indian-Muslim anti-colonial identification in the Khilafat movement with the Ottoman Empire. But my invocation of Winckelmann is relevant also to the historical situation the chapter Caledonia inhabits and seeks to engage. For Ferguson was very much a product of the milieu in which Winckelmann's work circulated, was likely to have encountered Henry Fuseli's translation of Winckelmann, and himself wrote a book called An Historical Inquiry into the True Principles of Beauty in Art, especially with reference to architecture in 1849. In which there were 3 chapters on Greece, Rome, and of course Egypt. Moreover, Heinrich Schliemann, the archaeologist famously associated with Mycenae, dedicated his book on the excavation at Tiryns, the prehistoric palace of kings of Tiryns, the results of the latest excavations, to Ferguson in 1885. Schliemann also, of course, wrote Mycenae, a narrative of researches and discoveries at Mycenae and Tiryns. In turn, John Marshall, the director of the Archaeological Service under Curzon, trained at the British School of Athens and was recruited from there, who had participated in the excavations in Crete and Turkey, would in 1924 publish a piece in the tabloid, the Illustrated London News, titled An Indian Tiryns and Mycenae, a Forgotten Age Revealed, about his excavations at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which are ancient Indus Valley civilizations. And here's the picture of the tabloid. So this is 1924, Illustrated London News. At the same time, with Caledonia, Heather accesses another aspect of post-Enlightenment European thought and art, as the title invokes Sir Walter Scott's O Caledonia from the Lay of the Last Minstrel, of course. I'm sure you were waiting for that, making the interrogation of the entwinement of the picturesque, primitivism, narratives of decline, and the advent of modernity and a certain romantic nationalism foundational to the critique presented in the novel. The Bengali character who buys the mansion, Caledonia, from the Scotsman's descendants, renames it Chandraganj, of which we are given a translation next to the name in the novel as Luna's Grove, and writes a poem in the chapter. Quote, it was summertime. He was in the process of settling down in his new house and was being inspired by its picturesque setting. It suddenly came to him, and I kind of love this. Mango birds ode to goddess Lakshmi. Winged songstresses in the garden of moon, trill they and lilt in mellifluous June. Lady of the lustrous lotus liver, O Padma, O Padma, bountiful Ma, prime giver. Not quite satisfied, he began again. O flighty singer of emerald June, trilling and lilting while the limpid moon. The muse was rudely disturbed by the coachman's child instead of Chandravati, the moon maiden, end of quote. The addition of the chapter, she's hilarious, and Often people don't remark that, but in any case. The addition of this chapter and the following one, The Golden Album, full of descriptions of photographs of westernized Indians and colonial elites, focuses the novel squarely on the epistemology of the colonial past. For by 1994, Hindutva had also begun to rise, and the post-colonial nation could be seen as fully constituted by the aesthetic, intellectual, and taxonomic structures of its colonial precursor. Heather's engagement with the Spade's contribution to the creation and dissemination of colonial knowledge gets played out more elaborately in The Transcreated River of Fire. Heather's interest in archaeology was already present in Ankh Qadariya. There she presents a character who sculpts a figure called the Sundarshan Yakshi in the earliest period, that is circa 320 BCE. It persists through the novel's different sections, making cameo, which are over 2,000 years, making cameo appearances in various conditions of ruination, and ends up curated in the National Museum under construction in Delhi around the 1950s, and the end of the novel. Following the Urdu relatively closely in River of Fire, a sculptor who is also a scholar thinks, quote, "Thought can only be thought. A real person is life itself, not a symbol of life. I cannot remain dispassionate or even neutral. Dhyan is the real artist." She doesn't translate it. How much time? 5? Okay. I've got 3 pages. Okay. Dhyan is the real art of the artist. Pure form, the concept of a thing which is itself inherent in the thing, is the real dhyan. How is the personalness of a thing to be ignored? He goes on to sculpt a plump, slender-waisted woman who is bending the twig of the exotic tree, just as he had seen Champak, the woman he was in love with, do a few weeks ago. So I'm going to skip quite a bit here. He called it the girl with the kadamba bow, Sudarshan Yakshini, tree sprite, good to behold. In a few days, Chandragupta Maurya will conquer the area. Gautam will be forced to fight and will lose his fingers and end up a performer in a traveling show. At the end of the novel, the statue ends up illegible, or perhaps only partially legible, and curated in a museum in the penultimate chapter, which is called Sudarshan Yakshini of the National Museum. It is just after partition, and a character called Kamal has returned to UP to settle matters of property because he has left for Pakistan. Significantly, in the English version, both male characters will visit museums in the other's new country. Gautam, the Indian, thinks about his visit to Taxila, another ancient civilization, and the museum there as he comes looking for Kamal, the Pakistani, in the National Museum in India. He sees the Sundarshan Yakshi and thinks, and I'm going to give you the Urdu and the English, and then give you the transcreated version. Cultural publicity के रसायल में इस ताज़ा दरियाफ्त के बारे में एक मज़मून होना चाहिए. इसने एक मुस्तैद और फ़र्ज़ शनास publicity expert की तरह सोचा. My translation: there should be an essay about this fresh discovery in magazines of cultural publicity, he thought, like an alert and dutiful and conscientious publicity expert. In River of Fire, there should be an article about it by Dr. Mulk Raj Anand in Marg, and one by Karl Khandlawala in the March of India, he thought, as a publicity expert. So what's going on here? The Rai dig in Anand refers to his writings on Hindu erotic sculpture. He co-wrote Homage to Khajuraho with the art historian Stella Kramrisch, which was a 1961 Merck publication, and Kamakala, some notes on the philosophical basis of Hindu erotic sculpture. Anand concluded his essay in Homage to Khajuraho with a quotation from Yeats. That with a mallet or chisel modeled these calculations that look but casual flesh, put down all Asiatic vague immensities. And then he goes on to talk about Salamis. And then Anand says, he goes on to say that these lines sum up one's feelings about the sculptors, who gave women dreams and dreams their looking glass. This is also from Yeats. Heather, of course, presents the sculptor as mildly revolted when he meets Champak, the object of the sculpture, some years later because of her middle-age spread and because now she has a child, critiquing the idealization of the female, which can become the very instrument of reviling the actuality of females that Anand and Yeats celebrate here. Yeah, Anand also says other things, which I'm going to cut out here. The figure of the Yakshi had, The figure of the Yakshi had acquired tremendous purchase in post-independence India and in the nationalist imagination, and soon after independence, the Yakshi had gotten embroiled in various nationalistic controversies. It is actually a figure of a sculpture. If colonial thinkers and administrators were uncomfortable with the eroticism of Hindu sculpture, Guha Thakurta has suggested that the relationship of post-colonial Indians and Hindu nationalists with the sculptures was also somewhat paradoxical and would involve strategic orchestration and obfuscation of the theme of sexuality in Indian art. And I just want to show you. So this is from Kamakala. And then here are a couple of yakshis. So you've seen these over the years, right? In addition, I might go 2 minutes over, sorry. In addition, the tensions around the national and religious ownership of the nude Hindu goddess would have the modernist painter, radically secular, but also Muslim, M.F. Hussain, well, Muslim in the sense that, anyway, driven out of India for hurting religious sentiments because he painted nude Hindu goddesses as a Muslim. As an aside, I should mention here that, and let me show you the image. This is one of the ones of Saraswati. As an aside, I should mention that the contemporary Pakistani painter, also I guess Muslim, Kumail Ajazuddin's Hijab and Durga is an interesting response to Hussein's plight. That's also Hindu goddess, highlighting the paradoxes. In other words, is a veiled Hindu goddess better than a nude one when painted by a Muslim? And what happens when heritage is subjected to religious ownership? It is worth noting that the phrase religious sentiments is from the Indian Penal Code of 1860, and now ubiquitous in both Hindu and Muslim nationalist religionized violence. But most salient in the context of Heather's novel, and amplified in the English version, is the return of the past as heritage, repackaged as national destiny, and at the same time, nation as commodified metaphysical essence, as perhaps best exemplified by Anand's grandiose declarations, which I didn't quote to you, which Heather parodies at the end. Transcreation, then, and I am concluding, is both the rendering of metaphysical stories into another language, and Heather was clearly drawing on P. Lal's arguments about his renderings of what he called Indian myths, raising the question, is it her novel, that is, her Urdu novel, that she transcreates, that is the metaphysical narrative, or is it narrativizing myth and metaphysics, right? Both the original novel and then I shouldn't say original, but the first novel and then the second one. At the same time, it is also possible, indeed likely, that at play is another sense of transcreation, that which has taken hold in the advertising world, where it refers to the privileging of the target audience rather than being focused on the fidelity to the original for the purposes of marketing products. For a novel that presents the production of heritage and national identity as commodity, such a meaning is appropriate, and the author who commented dryly to Kumkum Sangari's question about the absent epigraph in the English version, which she had translated into Urdu in Aankh Darya from T.S. Eliot's Dry Salvages, Chhut Gaya Hoga, probably got left behind, would have appreciated the irony. And this is untranslatable, but I tried. More broadly, though, the term transcreation and the way Heather put in play its practice in her English rewriting also brings to the fore her rather classical notion of the adib, author, writer, literata in Urdu, and in Arabic, from whence it comes into Urdu. The classical term includes the sense of encyclopedic narration, very much Heather's method already in Aankh Darya, and then both in River of Fire and in the additions to Fireflies in the Mist. Transcreation, as a rewriting of an author's own texts, questions some of the impositions of translation, while it also spins the idea and history of the novel as a form. If Aankh Darya obeyed few of the unities of time and character of the bourgeois novel, or whatever, the 18th century novel, although I don't know what to do with Chandy, in the first place, the transcreation makes the novel an infinitely rewritable and fluid form, capable of endless incompleteness, or alternately, and devastatingly in the Indian subcontinent, different completions. At the same time, Heather's practice of what she wouldn't call translation is consonant with a philology responsive to social assemblages and attentive to the situatedness of language R.A. Judy calls for in his 2010 essay, Reading with Discrepant Engagement. The question of situatedness, of historical situatedness, more precisely, and of course of historical situation, is one that Heather's transcreations pose quite elegantly. That is, what is historical situatedness, and what is the connection between translation and historical situation as we live through successive periods amidst historicism's ambiguous and proliferating gifts. The expansion, of which of course the nation is one, the expansion of the questions of classification in both novels wasn't just to bring the novel more fully into English by providing more historical context about the British in India, which would ostensibly situate the English language reader better, as some critics have suggested, but because the post-colonial state had so fully revealed its constitution by colonialism and the colonial state, proving, to twist a phrase from Donne, not a breach, but an expansion. For Heather, not only had the post-colonial state failed to deliver emancipation, its rupture of sociality and the ethnicized and religionized bloodletting that had followed both partitions had revealed how completely the classification and techniques of population management of the colonial period had countered the vicious nationalisms that propelled and continue to propel the violence. Just follow the news in India right now. Transcreation then, as elaboration, exacerbated parody, rendering of metaphysical speculation, editing, rewriting as she does in a particularly significant case in River of Fire, where she switches a character's garb from the orange robes of a Buddhist monk to the white clothing of a Greek traveler, is a way of exploring colonial epistemology in world-traversing ways while deploying the capacities it designates and encompasses for the necessary task of epistemic disruption. Thank you.
All right, so I guess first off, anybody who wants to, grab some coffee to warm your hands. The advantage is it's hard to fall asleep when it's cold, right? So I'll take that. I want to begin by thanking Gary for inviting me to participate in this incredible project, to be a part of it here today, and to thank all of you. I'll thank Lindsay, although I don't see her around, but obviously she makes this all happen. What I'll present today actually is part of a larger project, a book I'm finishing called The Myth of Emmanuel Levinas, which seeks to engage with his Talmudic lectures. And I do think certainly there's some resonance, at least in this question of positing of an inheritance that perhaps whether it's legitimately, whether one legitimately inserts oneself into it or constructs it. But I also think there are many of the same themes that were discussed last night and that certainly you would see in the first two chapters for sure of Bashir's book. And I'll try and fold that in along the way. So I suppose it makes sense to begin with Emmanuel Levinas's oft-stated and even more often cited claim that in his Talmudic lectures and his confessional or Jewish writings in general, his purpose is to translate Hebrew into Greek. For the sake of clarity, Levinas's Talmudic lectures refer to the lecture he gave almost each year at the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de Langue Française in Paris from 1960 to 1989. Now, his confessional writings are occasional pieces, written on topics that concern questions surrounding Judaism and Jewish identity, many of which appeared in publications of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, for whom Levinas worked as director of the École Normale Israélite Orientale from 1945 to 1961. And a number of writings published in books such as Difficult Freedom are more or less internal documents from the Alliance Israélite about the future of Jewish education, but there are others that take up a more philosophical approach to the questions of what it meant to be a Jew living in Europe or I suppose the world, but really in Europe, after the Shoah or the Holocaust, the extermination. Now, because many of Levinas's collections include writings from both genres, the Talmudic lectures and his confessional pieces, they've often been lumped together. And certainly Levinas himself places them in the same category or genre in relation to this project of translating Hebrew into Greek. He's said as much. Now, the statement itself, translating Hebrew into Greek, has been interpreted in myriad ways that run the gamut from Annette Aronowitz's very positive understanding of the statement as making universal what is or was particular, which she does in the introduction to her translations of Levinas's first two books of Talmudic lectures, and in English it's called 9 Talmudic Readings. And then, of course, there's the much more critical analysis by John Trubinsky in his book Levinas in the Post-Colonial, where he sees the endeavor as a privileging of European or Western thought. So, indeed, it's worth noting that Levinas himself saw the project of his Jewish or confessional writings as separate or distinct from his philosophical writings, going so far as to make sure that he had a different press for the publications of each. They were to be kept entirely separate from each other in the French intellectual world. Now, whether he saw his philosophical writings as falling under the category of Greek and his writings on topics of Jewish concern as Hebrew is an open and important question. But what we can say is that Levinas never stated the need for translation in reference to his philosophical writings, whereas it's something like a raison d'etre for the confessional ones. So, what does it mean for Emmanuel Levinas to translate Hebrew into Greek? A common place to look is in his Talmudic lecture, The Translation of the Scriptures, which he presented at the 23rd colloque in 1983. And here he says, and I quote him, "I have proceeded on my own, of course, in attributing to the Greek language the order, clarity, method, desire to move from the simple to the complex, and especially the unbiased quality of the language of Europe, or at least the language of the university as it should be. The language of a European university professor, one that the professor cultivates and speaks, even when denouncing the language of the university and rehabilitating the savage mind," a reference to Lévi-Strauss and La Pensée Sauvage. He continues, "I say it again a bit differently, and for me, this is the beauty of Greece that must dwell in the tents of Shem. It's the language of deciphering." And I think in this quote, we can see the basis for both Aronowitz and Trubinsky's understanding of what it means to translate Hebrew into Greek, depending on whether one emphasizes the order, clarity, and method of Greek as the language of deciphering, or the assumption of a direct lineage from Greek to European thought in distinction from the savage mind. And I will come back to each of these understandings, but first, I'd like to point out that for Levinas, translating Hebrew into Greek refers both to a need or desire for philosophy to express what is essential in Jewish thought, and this also is the desire for proximity to Europe, European thought, Christian thought. But it also refers specifically to the translation of the Old Testament or Septuagint into Greek, or the translation of the Torah into the Septuagint, I should say. In regard to the latter, in the same lecture, Levinas tells us that, quote, "The Greek Bible very quickly replaced the Hebrew one, which was read without being understood in the synagogue." This is to say, at the time of the translation, the Jews reading the Hebrew didn't understand what they were reading. It's the translation to Greek that made it accessible. And he tells us that Philo knew none other than the Greek, end quote. Now, the two types of translation are, of course, related, as the reference to Philo suggests, and Levinas asserts that in the Talmudic portion he's discussing in that lecture, there is, quote, "the sense of a sign of divine approval given to the undertaking itself of translating the Pentateuch into Greek. That is, and it's within the text, he says, is the approval of the Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's position. In this, do we not have here at least some indication of the sense in which Rabbinic Judaism wishes to be a part of Europe? A certain assimilation to Europe, not rejected by the Talmudic doctors as purely negative, end quote. The reference to the Septuagint is important because it points to the possibility of making the ancient texts accessible to a modern audience and also to a larger audience. The reference to philosophy holds equal weight for Levinas because it is a call to rigorous and careful thought, the language of deciphering. The two aspects converge in relation to Levinas's own goals for Judaism and Jewish thought after the Second World War. We see this in the makeup of the audience for his Talmudic lectures at the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de langue française, which at its inception in 1957 consisted of many assimilated French intellectuals of Jewish heritage, such as the philosopher Jean Paul, whose self-identification as a Jew was bound up almost entirely with the Vichy-era policies of persecution. They knew they were Jewish because they had been singled out as such. Here, translating Hebrew into Greek could be seen as a strategy of making a positive Jewish identity available and accessible to assimilated Jewish intellectuals with little or no background in Jewish ritual practice, let alone knowledge of Torah or Talmud. For many, though not all, of the initial participants at the colloque, the language of philosophy was far more familiar than the language of Torah or Talmud, Bergson or Husserl, rather than Maimonides or the Gaon of Vilna, who I'll talk about later. But this leads to a second, equally important point. In these lectures and in his writings, Levinas sought to establish himself in the Mitnagetic tradition of the Lithuanian Talmudic academies, which saw itself as counter to what Levinas calls the miraculous, mystical, and ultimately charismatic powers of the Hasidic rabbis. The tradition into which Levinas inserts himself as reader and teacher of Talmud comes from the land of his birth and conserves his own anti-mystical convictions. There is, therefore, something of revisionist autobiography in the qualities and positions Levinas finds in the work and influence of the famous Lithuanian Talmudists, the Gaon of Vilna and his disciple Chaim of Volozhin, especially given that Levinas himself did not attend a Talmudic academy or study Talmud during his youth in Lithuania, but came to it in France after the Second World War. He, in fact, studied Russian, learned Russian literature, and eventually entered a gymnasium before going on to the University of Strasbourg, where he took up phenomenology. Talmud, Hebrew in this sense, did not come till much later. The point here is that it's not difficult to draw a correlation between Levinas's emphasis on the Gaon of Vilna's call for a rational Talmudic science and dialectic in opposition to the sentimental mysticism of the Hasidic movement, and Levinas's own training in philosophy, his preference for close textual analysis and the contemplative life over and above claims to direct experience, sentimentalism, or mysticism. Both Levinas's desire to reach his intended assimilated audience and his preference for rational argument based on close textual analysis point to an allegiance to Europe, the project of the Enlightenment, and thus, in some sense, to Christianity. But it's also important to note that this allegiance is not an uncritical one. I think in some ways Drabinsky goes too far in his book. The universalism and rationalism that Levinas ascribes to Greek and thus to European thought is attractive, powerful, and seductive. But as such, Levinas also sees it as problematic. In his 1964 Talmudic lecture on the temptation of temptation, Levinas tells us that, quote, "The temptation of which he speaks may well describe the condition of the West," end quote. This temptation of temptation is, in fact, the temptation of philosophy, the seduction of reason as a tool by which humans can master and control the world around them. And thus we must also be aware that this temptation of temptation is one that seduced Levinas himself in the years before World War II, leading him from his studies in Russian literature and then Western philosophy to his tutelage under Martin Heidegger. In his 1963 Talmudic lecture, Toward the Other, Levinas makes explicit his regrets about following this course of study, the one that led him into the orbit of a philosopher who enthusiastically embraced National Socialism. But he also makes clear his explicit condemnation of Heidegger, Heidegger's political choices, and what he sees as the solipsistic nature of his philosophy. Indeed, in the figure and philosophy of Heidegger, Levinas detected the limitations and ultimate paucity of the Western philosophical tradition, whose origins he places in Greece, which, absent any divine connection, became completely unmoored from ethical direction. In his Talmudic lecture, The Model of the West, from the 17th colloque in 1976, Levinas states that, quote, Greek wisdom is an opening, but it is also the possibility of speaking through signs which are not universally understood and which, as signs of complicity, thus have the power to betray. Greek wisdom, inasmuch as it is enveloped by ambiguity in a certain language, is thus a weapon of ruse and domination. In philosophy, it is the fact that it is open to sophistry. In science, that it places itself in the service of strength and politics, end quote. For Levinas, the ultimate proof, the most damning proof of the inadequacy of Greek or European thought is the Holocaust, the extermination of 6 million Jews, including Levinas's immediate family in Lithuania and the Talmudic academies of which he speaks. In his 1961 piece, Jewish Thought Today, Levinas wrote, quote, many Jews continue to think that the rational aesthetic and political values of Greco-Roman humanism are the true foundation for the understanding between Jews and Christians, just as they form the basis for understanding all religions. But the extermination of the Jews signified a crisis for the world that Christianity had modeled for 20 centuries, end quote. To Levinas's mind, ethics is lacking in Greek thought, and the Christian European tradition he takes to be its heir. So despite his affinity and attraction to this tradition, he believed it must be challenged in the name of ethical responsibility. What's more, the events of World War II and his own internment in a German camp for Jewish prisoners of war made him keenly aware that this was a tradition to which he did not entirely belong and from which he could be excluded at any moment. But as noted, Levinas was unwilling to completely forsake this tradition. He goes so far as to cite a Talmudic passage stating, quote, Greek wisdom is not to be forbidden, end quote. Instead, Levinas argues for a link between Judaism and the Western tradition of philosophy, the realization of the universal aspirations of philosophy made manifest through the particular tradition of Judaism. And here I quote him again. It is not by virtue of simple chance that the way towards the synthesis of the Jewish revelation and Greek thought was masterfully traced by Maimonides, who is claimed by both Jewish and Muslim philosophers, that a profound respect for Greek knowledge already fills the wise men of the Talmud, that education for the Jew merges with instruction, and the ignorant man can never really be pious, end quote. Thus, the project of translating Hebrew into Greek is to serve as a corrective to this, the Greek or European tradition, wherein the ethical imperative revealed by the study of Talmud is to be disseminated via the universal language of philosophy. An essential goal of Levinas's lectures and writings on Jewish scripture was to lead educated and intelligent men and women through their training in Western philosophy back to revelation, and through revelation to election and ethics. This is one reason why Levinas refers to Judaism as, quote, a religion for adults. And we can talk about the all the problematic sides of this title. But to tie it to the text, it's because to his mind, or his understanding of monotheism, it has to be one shorn of mysticism and direct divine interface or intervention. Indeed, he goes so far as to claim that secular explanations for phenomenon that have no recourse to the divine are more proximate to his understanding of Judaism than most conventional understandings of that religion. In a piece from 1949, he tells us that, quote, atheism is much closer to the one God than the mystical experiences and horrors of the sacred to be found in the supposed religious revivals of our contemporaries, end quote. And in one of his first Talmudic lectures, he claims, quote, Judaism adores its God while remaining acutely aware of all of atheism's reasons, or capital R, reason, end quote. Thus, Levinas saw the interventions and innovations of European philosophy as a necessary step in human intellectual development, leading us away from an understanding of God and religion based on folklore or mythology, where fantastic deities intervened miraculously, to an understanding predicated on rational human action and human choice. It's an almost existential responsibility. And I'll quote him again. He says, "It is a great glory," he writes, "for the Creator to have set up a being who affirms him after having contested and denied him in the glorious areas of myth and enthusiasm. It is a great glory for God to have created a being capable of seeking him or hearing him from afar after having experienced separation and atheism," end quote. So this is a world understood through the lens of rational secular thought, but open to a relation with the divine that provides an ethical ground or some sort of backstop, which keeps reason from devolving into sophistry or the will to power. This is where Levinas's retrospective refashioning of himself as inheritor of the Lithuanian Talmudic tradition is essential for understanding his project of translating Hebrew into Greek, without succumbing to either the temptation of assimilation or regression to an irrational form of religious belief, specifically Hasidism. In reference to the Lithuanian Mitnagetic tradition, Levinas tells us that the Gaon of Vilna, who was a famous rabbi who instantiated this sort of rational investigation of the texts, as opposed to, say, Kabbalah, the Gaon of Vilna resisted the spread of Hasidism because, quote, this popular movement demanding more fervor than knowledge denied Talmudic science and dialectic their primary place in Jewish religious life, and that by grouping the communities around spiritual personalities with charismatic power, the tzaddikim, or the miraculous rabbis who did not refuse the adoration of the faithful, this changed the true relation between disciple and master and undermined the fundamental principles of Jewish monotheism, end quote. For Levinas, Jewish monotheism cannot be achieved through charismatic personalities or miraculous rabbis. But neither can it be achieved solely by adopting the principles of Enlightenment thought. As he also tells us, it's a long quote, but the influence of Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner, who is the disciple of the Gaon of Vilna, and the Talmudic studies that were renewed by the yeshiva of Volozhin that he created, and the houses of study that were created after its example, perhaps also shows through in the way that the Age of Enlightenment, the rationalism of the Haskalah, had been assumed by the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. From the 19th century onwards, they in fact found themselves progressively led towards studies that were different to those of the Torah, and towards which Western European Jewry had voluntarily been entering since the 18th century. This movement towards so-called modern life really became apparent with the Russian, Polish, and Lithuanian Jews almost concurrently with the influence that can be attributed to the yeshiva of Volozhin. But while undergoing the seduction of the West and its rationalist culture, Eastern Judaism, for the greater part, remained immunized against the temptations of pure and simple assimilation to the surrounding world, end quote. Now, the historical accuracy of this statement is less important to me than the way it confers a special place to Eastern European Jews and thus to Levinas himself as uniquely positioned to navigate between rational Western discourse, Greek, and the study of Torah, Hebrew. Most notable is the fact that Levinas's characterization of the simultaneous appropriation and resistance to the West and its rationalist culture is one that I would argue can only be applied to Levinas himself retrospectively. It isn't actually his educational route. Nevertheless, Levinas does insert himself into the Lithuanian Talmudic chain of transmission as both an authority on the Gaon of Vilna and Chaim of Volozhin, and as the embodiment of an Eastern European Jew who moves progressively towards studies that were different to those of the Torah in ways that conserved his particular interest and training in European philosophy, and specifically phenomenology. Thus, I'd say there is much that is laudable in Levinas's translation project, and this is in line with Aronowitz's assessment, but the special relationship that Levinas articulates between Hebrew and Greek, between a certain conception of Judaism in Europe, also serves to create a formidable and I would say double blind spot in his project, and this aligns with the work of Drabinsky. This is first because, as we've seen, Levinas buys into the fantasy that European culture and philosophy is the privileged direct inheritors and thus proprietary owners, as it were, of Greek thought, and by extension to the claim to universalism. Though, as we've seen, this is not without caveats and correctives that he deploys, but this leads to the second blind spot. Levinas's emphasis on an equally privileged place for the tradition of Jewish thought, and specifically Jewish texts, designates the Jew as the other par excellence, the exemplary other, to, I would argue, the likely exclusion of all other others. In this way, the Jewish and the Greek European traditions are privileged in a way that pushes aside other cultures, traditions, ways of thought. And it's particularly notable, especially after our discussion last night, that Levinas follows Franz Rosenzweig in creating a Jewish-Christian axis and not a Jewish-Muslim or even Jewish-Christian-Muslim one. And I say this partly because of the affinities between the religions of monotheism and the interconnections of the three in the transmission of Greek philosophy, not to mention Levinas's own use of Maimonides, but also in Levinas's work for the Alliance Israélite Universelle and the École Normale Israélite Orientale, he was charged with the education of Jewish youth who came predominantly from North African countries and arrived in Paris for their training to become teachers when they returned, and did so until such a time as this axis shifted from the training in Paris to these students going to Israel. Of course, the mission and reach of the Alliance Israélite, including the use of French as its language of instruction, also points to the privileging of European values and the mission civilisatrice that accompanied them. Thus, while the engagement or relationship with European Christianity is prevalent throughout his writings, the possibility of a relationship with Islam and what this could mean is sparse at best, and becomes increasingly problematic over time, given the historical realities of French decolonization, the Algerian conflict, but also, and more visibly for Levinas, in terms of his evaluation and allegiance to the state of Israel, which seems to be in direct contradiction to other statements he makes about the people of Israel being one without a place, of being a people with a book. And it becomes increasingly difficult and often aggressive. There's no way to sugarcoat this. The problem's equally pronounced in Levinas's dismissal of all peoples and religions that are not monotheistic. These peoples are often described as underdeveloped, irrational, and thus, at some level, primitive. In Jewish Thought Today, a scant 2 pages after he extols the possibility of Jewish thought engaging with universal humanity of every faith and nation, he goes on to ask whether, quote, the rise of the countless masses of Asiatic and underdeveloped people threaten this newfound authenticity, end quote. His answer further betrays his own prejudices and fears as he frets that, quote, under the greedy eyes of these countless hordes who wish to hope and live, we, the Jews and Christians, are pushed to the margin of history, end quote. Now, there are other such examples, and one could look to Drabinsky's book for a thorough account. One could go on and on. Reading Levinas, it's embarrassing as you go through, and it makes it hard to imagine what the next stop would be. The point here is that this blind spot created by Levinas's translation project, Hebrew into Greek, seems to entirely undercut the message of responsibility toward the other that is the basis for his ethics, not only in the confessional writings, but also in his philosophical ones. If the account rests on what is, in the end, I would say, a historical argument about the development of rational thought in the West, and then leads to ethics on the basis of a Jewish reason that is, quote, beyond reason in rational truth itself, a personal relation in the universal and truth that surpasses and incorporates atheism, end quote, then what we're really talking about is a modified Enlightenment narrative, not dissimilar in structure to the progress narratives of Whiggish history, French Enlightenment universalism, or Hegel's Journey of the Spirit. This logic of progress, this teleology, creates what Dipesh Chakrabarty has called a waiting room of history, where some peoples are destined to lag behind others in the hierarchy of progress until such a time as they are deemed sufficiently caught up to enter the game. As such, Levinas's project would at worst be impeached, or at best require serious modification. But perhaps history is precisely the problem. And given Levinas's own distrust of history as an explanatory or meaning-making device, in briefly this last portion of the paper, I think it worth revisiting the project of translation shorn of its contextual baggage and the implied historical teleology. And I say this not to rehabilitate Levinas or exonerate him in his work, but because there's an alternative logic at work in Levinas's project, the project of translation, that is completely at odds with the more historical one, even if both are available. I would also say that this alternative logic is one less apparent to the historian whose tools of chronological contextualization and narrative explanation favor the sort of account with which I began this talk. So, given the critique at the heart of Levinas's use of Greek, European, Christian philosophy, let's see if we can tackle translation at a different level to liberate it from the presumptions that reason belongs to Greek and ethics belongs to Hebrew. I don't know if we can, and I don't think that we should, but we can't completely free it. The one nibbles at the other. But what this would be in the end is an uncanny translation of the Word of God into the language of humanity. So Levinas seems to suggest that our modern understanding of history, one to which, at least in some aspects, he ultimately subscribes, creates blind spots by obscuring what is important in meaningful texts. In a lecture from 1982 for A Place in the Bible, he asks, quote, is it not perhaps the case that the idea of a thought worthy of the name rise above their own history, royally indifferent to their historians? There are perhaps more constants through time than one is led to believe by the difference of language, differences that in most cases come only from the variety of metaphor. And perhaps modernity, that is the claim of deciphering all the metaphors, is but the creation of metaphors whose wisdom can already be grasped in ancient ways of speaking, end quote. Elsewhere he states that, quote, it is necessary to consider these texts from various epochs as contemporaneous. lamenting that, quote, the lucid work of historians and Jewish and non-Jewish critics who can reduce the Jewish miracle of revelation or that of national spirit to a multiplicity of influences that they have undergone, lose its spiritual importance at the critical hours which have frequently struck in the course of 2,000 years for post-exilic Judaism. This is to say, the message grows cold at the times when perhaps it's needed most. One must, in a sense, step out of time to enter the Talmud. And in doing so, one suspends what we might call the bias of the modern and the presumption that we now know better than those who came before us. But the suspension must be done so that the text from then can speak to us now. When discussing the Exodus, the point is not to recount a story of long ago for its own sake, or to champion a triumph over adversity indicating our superior position in the present. Instead, the reader must inhabit the position of the text as their point of departure. And here I quote him, "The trauma I experience as a slave in the land of Egypt constitutes my humanity itself," end quote, and should in some way instill an ethical imperative, though not in any Kantian sense of the term. On such an unstable temporal scaffold, there is not one definition of ethics for all time, though there is an ethics that is eternally available and must be applied practically in each case. The act of translation is not from Hebrew into Greek, but the word of God into the language of humankind, which is a destabilization of the logic of universal and particular, as in a way each can be seen inside the other, but always must be available for practical usage in any given particular context or place. Thus, for Levinas, quote, "The scriptures have a mode of being that is quite different from the exercise material for grammarians, entirely subject to philologists. A mode of being where the history of each piece of writing counts less than the lessons it contains and where its inspiration is measured by what it inspires," end quote. What counts or should count is not the particular historical context in which the writing occurred, but instead the inspiration it imparts for the present. And this is why he sees the study of Talmud as essential to his endeavor, because it is comprised of both the written revelation at Mount Sinai, which was codified in the Pentateuch or Old Testament, and also of the oral revelation, which Levinas tells us holds equal weight, but was given in a way so as never to be codified. To be sure, it was eventually written as the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud, but in Levinas's words, its writing came down late. Thus, for Levinas, I quote him again, "Writing is immediately bound to an oral Torah, at once preliminary and renewing. This is not an historical contingency, but an essential possibility of spirit, one of its vocations. The Jewish reading is anything but unbiased, although here being a biased reader means not the sterility of dogmatic prejudices, but the possibilities and risks of transcending the given, and probably the extraordinary trace that Revelation leaves in a thought that, beyond the vision of being, here's the word of God," end quote. It is significant for Levinas that, quote, "the Talmud is the other form of revelation, distinct from the Old Testament, which Christians and Jews have in common," end quote, because the Talmud here becomes a site of understanding uncoupled from historical development. The distinction should not be seen here in terms of exemplarism, though one could see it that way in relation to our previous contextualist narrative, but instead in the way that the lessons of the Talmud do not derive from historical development. We don't see a building of Old Testament, New Testament, Quran, Enlightenment now. They're not bound to any moment in time, and they're not bound to any moment in place, but must be seen as a sort of continuous revelation, a reworking of the book, a saying that says more than it says. The revelation of oral tradition is, in a sense, timeless, as it is open to perpetual contestation, where, quote, Consequently, the Talmudic texts, even in the physiognomical aspects that their typography takes on, are accompanied by commentaries and by commentaries on discussions of these commentaries. And if you've ever seen a piece of Talmud, what you'll have is first the Mishnah, which is drawn from the Old Testament, then the Gemara, which are the sort of some of the codified commentaries on it, and then around these you have later instantations of commentaries and disputes. They don't agree with each other. They often move in different directions, and there's never conclusion. It's not meant to conclude. It's almost done. It's perhaps ironic that Levinas here calls for the need to read these texts precisely in their original Hebrew and Aramaic, which appears to be the inversion of the mandate to translate Hebrew into Greek. But we should be aware that any project of translation also carries the risk of codifying or freezing the translated text into forms that themselves become relics, thus short-circuiting the possibility of renewal. So the return to the ancient language, not a language of fetish for origins, but a further destabilization of any one hegemonic meaning. Here I quote him again with its ellipses, the unpredictable behavior of its vocables, its figures foreign to all rhetoric, its ostensible non sequiturs. The Talmud seems to be a medium marvelously well suited to permanent interrogation through which various eras can communicate, end quote. On this reading, Talmud is always in need of translation into the present context and into living language by means of exegesis, wherein the dialectic or contestatory relation of written and oral revelation in Talmud excludes, and here I quote Levinas, any idea of doctrinal authority, end quote. This is a continuous revelation, a saying that says more than it says, permanently engendering new meanings that each speak to their own time because they are attuned to the other. And this, for Levinas, is the meaning of election, an ethical ideal translated into a practical application. Now, whether such a medium or message is possible, given the first narrative I presented, is the one that should be argued and debated. But perhaps that's precisely the message of the final portion of the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Two terrific papers. We started about a half hour late. Both papers went over a little bit, but what we'll do is gather up comments. We'll take about 15 minutes for discussion, which is not the 30 we hoped for, but it all equals out. So let's take comments, questions together, and then you guys can make a final set of, offer some final reflections on whatever comes up. Lydia. Do we have a microphone?
There's a mic over there, I think, behind the TV.
Thank you very much.
There's a mic there. Just terrible acoustics in here, so gotta speak up.
The question is for Sadia. Thank you very much for your talk, which gives us the visual material, archaeology, and the novel. And I wonder if you could elaborate on how to think about visual translation and also the paintings on the ruins. It seems there is, you were suggesting some kind of a commensurability, or are you pointing at something else in the apparent commensurability? You know, the runes in the paintings that you just showed us. I didn't catch the names of the painters. Was it a replica, a reproduction, speaking, evoking some other paintings? You see, that kind of commensurability, how does that speak to the question of translation, if you could elaborate on that?
Let's see if there are any others. Other questions? Let me throw a couple of things into the mix. I don't know if this is clear. I love the transcreation. I mean, I'd need to, kind of tired and distracted, would need to read your beautiful paper to really have, to comment clearly. But maybe this was clear all throughout, but I want to give you another chance to say a little bit more about transcreation versus translation in relation specifically to form. It's very interesting that, so this rewriting of the novel back and forth, whether there's a way in which that practice of transcreation is specifically oriented towards the question of form that's in your title, whether it is about shifting form or placing the very idea of form into question, do that. And I'm very interested in that in relation to the partition, violence specifically. And Ethan, also, you threw me in that last fascinating quarter of the paper where suddenly it came around in a more useful way. But I guess in the first 2/3 of the 3/4 of the paper, I was more struck by the way in which, I mean, I guess I wonder not just about his late turn to Talmud, but about that as a specific response to his earlier self, and especially to the Heideggerian moment, because it does strike me that strange that his writings about the face and infinity in some ways are more deeply theological in some sense, or non-rational or anti-rational, not mystical in that Hasidic sense, but kind of placing that whole philosophical tradition more into question in his philosophical writings. And then he goes into this story about the relationship between Greek and Hebrew and this reading of Talmud that is so deeply rational and philosophical and kind of domesticates. I mean, I was expecting almost in the spirit of Sadia's work to hear more about the ways in which thinking about Greek and Hebrew might have separated Greek from that tradition and disrupted that linear story as Bashir did last night. And you start to do that a little bit at the end, but so I guess I'm just, really struck by the rationalism of the religious writings and whether that was a strange way of reckoning with his own past. Yeah. Anyone else before we let these guys say a little bit? David.
I wanted to formulate a question between the two talks, which might take some stumbling, but it seems to me that you're both thinking about heritage as a secular strategy on some level that then opposes itself to a certain kind of religious power that could be under colonial domination on the one hand or under annihilation on the other in the Jewish case. And I guess I'm just curious, this was, more explicit in your talk, but I mean, I think that the notion of a Jewish heritage being installed in a group of French secularized Jewish intellectuals through a reading of the Talmud that brings it into that tradition is a kind of, bid for a heritage as well. And so I guess I'm just curious to hear how you might think together about this as a kind of particularly modern strategy that sometimes attaches to nationalism, but sometimes really doesn't in the case of Levinas, if that makes sense. I don't know.
So first to Lydia's question. No, I wasn't suggesting commensurability at all. In fact, the piece neither Greek nor Indian that I've mentioned several times, I actually take on Heather's reading of ekphrasis and practice of ekphrasis, where I think that in her case, it's a way of exploring the illegibility of the visual in some ways, especially in historical terms. What I don't say there is I don't take the position that, so she's performing various narratives about the visual, right? So you see this thing over time, and there are different ways of talking about it. The curation is one version of the representation. The debates about it, there are Orientalist discussions of it, there are non-Orientalist discussions of it. But the position I don't take, right, and I think that she's actually pushing back against, is this tension between words and pictures in Western thinking about ekphrasis, right? That I think that she's thematizing the problematic of the tension between words and the visual throughout her novel. Now, what was happening in the talk, in some ways, right, and I don't think it comes through in the talk at all, because I realized that I'd thrown in the term ekphrasis but done nothing with it, is that in some sense, I was also, the talk was a little bit more narrative than I would have liked it to be, for the simple reason that I just assume nobody knows these texts, right? That especially the Heather, and so I'm also trying to introduce people to a text that I think is a set of texts that is remarkably important, I think, for South Asian literature, but also for South Asian thinking, whether it's philosophical or otherwise. What was going on you might say that there's a kind of underlying dual strategy in the paper, or a double failure in the paper, as you might think about it, is that I'm also trying to introduce people to a kind of visual world in which she's writing and to which she is slowly responding over time, and which is developing its own rhetoric, right? So the first set of illustrations or lithographs is from Ferguson himself, who's also producing a certain narrative of Indian archaeology and ruins. And that narrative is interesting because it comes to actually reformulate, in some sense, the visual culture of Indian painting. I mean, Ravi Verma and some of the painters from the 19th century or early 20th, are unthinkable without this. It's also a kind of homogenizing strategy visually, because I wanted, in some longer version, an ideal version of this, I would want to show, paintings of Tintern Abbey and Constable. So there's something going on in a kind of homogenizing of the world visually as well that I'm really interested in, which I couldn't go into here. And so the incommensurability at some level for Heather is there, and she's trying to work it out even in her different versions in Urdu and English. And then some of the modern paintings, I think, are trying to engage with that history and the very question of heritage. Now, I'm going to connect that to David, right? Is heritage secular? The way I'm using heritage, there's certainly something, there's a kind of Lockeanism, if you will, about Curzon's speech, almost, right? So it's a kind of ecumenical Christianity that allows him to say that we can preserve better all of these different monuments from the different religions because, we're impartial, right? So secularism there becomes a kind of impartiality, right? Heritage, I have written elsewhere that there's there is a Muslim discourse, for instance, of ruination, and it's rather different, right? So it's not about packaging, it's about, look at this and remember that God can do this to you too, and it's in the Quran, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a particular kind of secularism to Curzon's position, and that speech is remarkable for that, and I'd want to write about it. So I don't know if I answered Lydia's question, but you can scold me later and we'll come back to it, maybe your lunch. And, but then the question of, specifically oriented to the question of form, this is very preliminary, and I say that not defensively or apologetically, but because this is absolutely new work.
Let me rephrase,
Yeah.
because maybe form, since that's so central, in a really simplistic way, stepping back from the paper,
Yeah.
I'm really interested in what this fascinating idea of transcreation gives us in this conversation about translation, because you had very interesting moments of saying transcreation in relation to or as distinct from translation. She's doing both, and I'm really excited about this idea, so I want you to speak just kind of in a direct way about it.
I don't know if I can, and this is why. I'm ambivalent about it, right?
Okay.
I'm not ambivalent about the way she does it, right? I mean, I think that what she does with it is magnificent. And I do think it is an epistemological challenge. I mean, I really do think it is about epistemic disruption. She's calling into question the very form of the novel, but she's also rethinking the history of Urdu in India, right? Which in 1990, under Hindutva, the rise of Hindutva, is absolutely crucial. Right, so she's Mr. Transcreation, which could, from one angle, look like abundance and cornucopia and encyclopedic narration as cornucopia, is actually, in her case, is actually marking the destruction of a language, right? So abundance could be read there as both a kind of, so if it is cornucopia, right, it's cornucopia as retrospective and mournful archive. This is what's lost to you, and it's possibly likely, and people who write in English say this all the time, this is what's lost to our children. They don't even have the Urdu to appreciate this, so we'll give it to them in English. So there's this kind of proliferating, and other English writers from South Asia do this. This is what's under attack, this is what's lost. And on the one hand, on the other hand, here's a history that in 1955 or in 1947, we thought we would leave behind with independence itself. But instead, it turns out that not only is it haunting us, right, it has become the very grounds of our existence, right? And that is what, in my view, Hindutva and all certain versions of Pakistani violence, Muslim nationalism are. So I think that she, in 1947, is already devastated, right? But by 1990, as somebody who came to Pakistan, didn't like what Pakistan was going to do with that kind of, where she thought Pakistan had turned Urdu into commodity and cultural commodity, went back to India, and then had to live through the 90s, right? And this is, by the way, the same period that the Mir's Last Sigh is dealing with. So I think that transcreation there is, the creativity of it is almost, the creation part of it is almost misleading, because I actually think that it's an index of devastation, right? That we produce archives at the very moment when we think they may not be available to us, for her at least. And I think that's happening a lot in South Asia right now, right? So, so what do I think of it? I mean, I think it's a great concept. I mean, I love the idea from another point of form where you can rewrite everything. I love that, right? Great, terrific. Let's do it, right? But no, I have nothing kind of happy to say about it.
So I'll
Blended with endless rewriting also.
Well, I begin with endless rewriting. So starting with endless rewriting, the points that you each bring up, part of that has to do with the balance of the paper, and I did struggle with the balance of the paper. I guess it's the opposite of having the preliminary work, the work that's where I have too much because the book's almost finished, and what to include and not to include. And one of the things that struck me as difficult was to make sure that a more traditional narrative, explanatory narrative that connects the pieces of what Levinas and others seem to think he's doing in translating Hebrew into Greek is put front and center before moving to what I would argue is actually a more interesting project of translation that he refers to as theologies or logics of God, multiple logics of God. And I think it's actually in the multiple logics of God part that there was the final portion of the paper, this infinite renewing, that the most interesting possibilities come out for questions like translation. The problem is if one points to those in advance of working through the more uncomfortable aspects of what he said and wrote, then I don't think you actually go back to revisit them in a way that forces you to consider the ways that the writings that all of us do with intentions toward often ethical ends are ones that also do violence at the same time. And so if you don't see the more violent aspects before moving into this other realm of trying to think of the productive aspects, then there's a danger of reinscription, of losing track of the way that the opening is a kind of a closing as well. And so I you know, within the paper itself, I realized that it was a sort of a little bomb dropped at the end, but in a provocative way. And I guess then this moves to this question of heritage, which it's certainly the case that in the way the story's told, or most of the story was told, it really is a secular narrative trying to figure out the reasons why someone would come and take up these things after World War II in the way that he did. But I think to Levinas's mind, and equally important, is that's not what's happening at all. This actually is a divine inheritance that needs to be taken up for deeply ethical reasons, and that we should take that equally seriously. We should not explain away this attempt to connect to something that in the philosophical work I would say is the extra-rational aspect. The idea that there's a bottom where reason sort of bottoms out. I mean, it's almost a Cartesian one, but then you have to be open to what that is, and it's a kind of imperative for Levinas, and what that imperative is, it's a commandment to the face of the other, to open to the other, to realize that the space you're taking up treads upon the other. And if you work only in the purely rational realm, then you don't get it. If you work only in the purely secular realm, you don't get it. But the last thing I would say is I don't think this is a modern problem, or a modern issue even. Even if you think about Levinas's goal of going into this room of French intellectuals who had never spent a day in synagogue in their life and never even considered themselves as particularly Jewish, but trying then to initiate a dialogue about something like a heritage or an identity, however unstable that might be. I don't think it's entirely dissimilar to the translation of the Septuagint and the bringing of Hebrew into Greek in actuality in that moment, precisely to allow people to read what they're hearing or trying to hear. I think often we assume the modern to be so different from what came before, and that also arrests us, stops us from this more transhistorical or transcendent possibilities of meaning, which when available to us, again, attune us to hearing things, to seeing things that we might not have other heard. It's a different kind of attunement to the other. It's a temporal attunement. But as long as we think there's something special going on in modernity, I think we lose that. I think there's nothing more strange or less strange about the modern. It's different, but it's not different in that way. So.
Well, I think we're going to stop here. I appreciate that you both put temporal translation on the table also, and we're going to continue on directly into the next panel, and then we'll be just a half hour off, but like recalibrated. Thank you, guys.